The scorching summer sun beat down on Josephine Zimmer as she sprinted across the parched Texas plains, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Blood trickled from her raw ankles where the iron shackles had dug into her flesh for the past 3 years. Freedom was both terrifying and intoxicating as she gulped the dusty air, the sound of hoofbeats growing fainter behind her. It was 1875, and Josephine had just escaped from Victor Roth, the man who had purchased her from an orphanage when she was 15 under the guise of offering her work as a housemaid. Now, at 20, she had finally seized her chance to flee when he'd left her chain loosely fastened while entertaining business associates at his ranch outside Austin. Josephine's lungs burned as she pushed through tall prairie grass, her tattered dress catching on wild brambles. The distant thunder of horses urged her forward even as her strength began to wane. 3 days without proper food had left her weak, but the thought of returning to Roth's clutches was more unbearable than any physical pain. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, Josephine spotted a creek cutting through the plains ahead. Water meant life, and perhaps a chance to obscure her trail. She stumbled toward it, desperation lending speed to her faltering steps. The creek wasn't deep, but the cool water soothed her blistered feet as she waded in. Josephine followed the current, careful to stay in the water where her tracks wouldn't show. The strategy had worked during her 2 previous escape attempts, but Roth had always found her. This time had to be different. Night fell quickly, draping the prairie in darkness. The moon, a thin crescent, provided little light as Josephine finally emerged from the creek, shivering despite the warm summer air. In the distance, she could make out the faint glow of lamplight, a homestead or perhaps a small town. Light meant people, and people meant danger. Yet the alternative, spending the night alone on the open prairie with Roth's men combing the landscape, seemed worse. Gathering what little strength remained, Josephine forced herself toward the distant glow. As she drew closer, the outline of a modest ranch came into view. A main house stood alongside a barn and corral where several horses moved restlessly in the moonlight. No dogs barked at her approach, a small mercy. Josephine paused at the edge of the property, weighing her options. The barn might offer shelter without requiring her to announce her presence. Moving as silently as her exhaustion would allow, she approached the wooden structure. The large door was secured with a simple latch, which she lifted with trembling fingers. Inside, the sweet smell of hay and horses enveloped her. Several animals shifted in their stalls, but none made enough noise to raise alarm. Josephine found an empty stall with fresh hay and collapsed into it, her legs finally giving out. Sleep overcame her almost instantly, a dreamless void that offered temporary respite from her terror. The sound of the barn door opening jolted her awake. Dawn light filtered through gaps in the wooden slats, and Josephine curled deeper into the hay, hoping to remain unseen. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by a soft whistling. "Well now, what do we have here?" The deep voice sent panic coursing through her veins. Josephine scrambled backward, pressing herself against the stall wall as a tall figure blocked her exit. Ethan Vance had been running his small cattle operation for 5 years, ever since returning from the war with enough saved pay to purchase this modest spread. At 32, he'd grown accustomed to solitude, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of ranch life. Nothing about finding a half-starved woman hiding in his barn was predictable. "I mean you no harm, miss," he said softly, keeping his distance. "Are you hurt?" Josephine remained silent, eyes darting around for escape routes. This man didn't look like one of Roth's hired guns. His clothes were simple but clean, his face open and weathered by honest work rather than violence. Still, experience had taught her that appearances could deceive. "I'll leave," she managed to say, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Please, just let me go." Ethan frowned, taking in her appearance the torn dress, the mud-caked feet, and most alarmingly, the raw, bleeding rings around her ankles. "Those look like shackle marks," he observed quietly. Josephine's eyes widened with fresh fear. "I'm not a criminal," she whispered. "Didn't figure you were." Ethan remained where he stood, making no move toward her. "Looks to me like you're running from something or someone," a sob caught in Josephine's throat. He'll kill me if he finds me. Ethan's jaw tightened. Nobody's going to find you here unless I allow it, he said firmly, and I don't much care for men who chain women. Before Josephine could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Terror seized her features as she pressed deeper into the hay. That'll be them, she whispered. Roth's men. Ethan's expression darkened. Victor Roth, at her nod, his mouth set in a grim line. I know of him. Stay here. He moved with surprising speed for his size, closing the stall door and covering her hiding place with more hay. Don't make a sound, he instructed before striding out of the barn. Josephine curled into herself, trembling as she listened to the approaching riders. Through a crack in the barn wall, she could see 3 mounted men pulling up to where Ethan now stood casually in his yard, one hand resting on the rifle propped against the fence post. Morning, gentlemen, Ethan called. Something I can help you with. The lead rider, a burly man with a scar cutting through his beard, leaned forward in his saddle. Looking for a runaway. Young woman, dark hair, blue dress. Belongs to Mr. Roth. Seen anyone matching that description? Ethan shook his head. Can't say that I have. Not many folks pass through these parts, especially not young women traveling alone. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. Mind if we take a look around? Mr. Roth's offering a substantial reward for her return. I mind considerably, Ethan replied, his tone remaining even as his hand drifted closer to his rifle. This is private property, and I don't recall inviting you gentlemen for a visit. The tension stretched between them like a taut wire. Josephine held her breath, certain that violence would erupt at any moment. Finally, the leader spat on the ground. You see her, you let Roth know. That girl is his property, legal and proper. Hiding her would be theft. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan replied coldly. Now, unless you're planning to pay for grazing rights, I'd appreciate it if you'd move your horses off my grass. The 3 men exchanged glances before the leader jerked his head to the east. We'll continue our search. Remember what I said about the reward, it's generous. Good day, gentlemen, Ethan responded, watching impassively as they rode away. Only when the riders had disappeared from sight did he return to the barn, moving unhurriedly as if concerned about being observed from a distance. Inside, he found Josephine exactly where he'd left her, though she'd pushed the hay aside to watch through the crack in the wall. They're gone for now, he said, but they'll be back. Roth isn't a man who gives up easily on what he considers his. Josephine emerged shakily from the stall. Why did you help me? Ethan's expression softened. Let's just say I've seen enough of men like Roth to last several lifetimes. I can't stay, she said, though her legs trembled beneath her. They'll come back and you'll be in danger. You're in no condition to travel, Ethan countered, gesturing to her wounded ankles and obvious exhaustion. And I can handle men like that. He paused, studying her with kind gray eyes. What's your name? She hesitated before answering. Josephine Zimmer. Miss Zimmer, he said with a slight nod. I'm Ethan Vance. Now, how about we get you something to eat and tend to those wounds? Josephine wanted to refuse to continue running, but her body betrayed her as she swayed on her feet. Ethan moved forward quickly to steady her, his touch gentle as he caught her elbow. One day, he said quietly. Rest for one day, eat some proper food, and then decide what you want to do. The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with genuine concern. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded wordlessly. Ethan's home was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture and plain curtains covering the windows. He led Josephine to a wooden table and gestured for her to sit while he moved to the stove, where a pot of coffee already percolated. I've got some stew left from yesterday, he said, ladling the contents of a cast iron pot into a bowl. And there's bread I baked a couple days ago. The aroma of the food made Josephine's stomach clench painfully. When Ethan set the bowl before her, she had to force herself to eat slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to devour it as quickly as possible. How long were you with Roth? Ethan asked as he sat across from her with his own cup of coffee. Josephine swallowed a spoonful of stew before answering. 3 years. I was sent to work as his housemaid when I was 17 after my parents died. The orphanage said it was a good placement. Her voice grew bitter. I learned quickly that wasn't true. Ethan's knuckles whitened around his cup. "And he kept you chained," she nodded, staring into her bowl. "Not at first. He waited until my second attempt to run away, said he'd invested too much to lose me." "Invested," Ethan repeated, disgust evident in his tone. "As if you were cattle." "To him, I was worth less," Josephine said softly. "At least cattle serve a purpose beyond his amusement." Ethan fell silent, his jaw working as he processed her words. Finally, he rose and fetched a small wooden box from a shelf. "Let's see to those ankles." The salve he applied stung, but Josephine bit her lip and endured it without complaint. His hands were calloused from ranch work, yet he touched her with surprising gentleness, carefully wrapping clean strips of cloth around her wounds. "You should rest," he said when he finished. "I've got a spare room. It's not much, but the door has a lock from the inside." The mention of a lock nearly brought tears to her eyes again. Such a small thing, privacy and security, yet it had been denied her for so long. "Thank you," she whispered. The room was indeed simple, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a small dresser, and a chair beneath a window that looked out over the rolling prairie. Ethan showed her how the lock worked, demonstrated that the window opened easily should she need to escape, then left her with a clean shirt of his to sleep in. Alone, Josephine sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. She had expected to die in her escape attempt, had almost welcomed the possibility as an alternative to returning to Roth. Instead, she found herself in the home of a stranger who had risked himself to protect her. Sleep claimed her quickly, despite her intention to remain vigilant. When she woke, the sun was already high in the sky. Panic seized her momentarily at the unfamiliar surroundings before memory returned. She dressed quickly in her dirty dress, reluctant to impose further by wearing Ethan's clothing, and ventured out of the room. Ethan was nowhere to be found inside the house, but through the window, she could see him in the corral, working with a spirited young horse. Josephine watched for a moment, struck by the contrast between Ethan's patient handling of the animal and Roth's brutal methods of control. The kitchen was tidy, with no signs that Ethan had eaten before heading out to work. Josephine hesitated, then began opening cupboards, finding basic supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans. It had been months since she'd been allowed to cook rather than serve, but the knowledge remained. By the time Ethan returned to the house, sweat-soaked and dusty from his morning's labor, Josephine had prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans. She froze when he entered, suddenly afraid she had overstepped. "I hope you don't mind," she said quickly. "I wanted to repay your kindness somehow." Ethan's surprise gave way to a warm smile. "Mind, this is the finest thing I've walked in to find in years." He moved to the wash basin to clean his hands and face. "Most days I'm lucky if I remember to eat before sundown." They ate in companionable silence, Josephine relaxing incrementally as it became clear that Ethan genuinely appreciated her gesture. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said. "Roth's men won't give up easily, especially if he's as fixated on you as it seems." Josephine's stomach nodded. "I know, I should leave before I bring trouble to your door." "That's not what I'm suggesting," Ethan replied. "Running with no plan, no supplies, and nowhere to go isn't likely to end well, especially not when Roth's claiming legal ownership." "He has papers," Josephine admitted. "The orphanage matron signed them. I didn't understand what they meant at the time." Ethan nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. So long as those papers exist, you'll never truly be free. He'll always have the law on his side." "What choice do I have?" Despair tinged her voice. "We buy your freedom," Ethan said simply. Josephine stared at him. "Buy it? I don't understand." "If Roth sees you as property, then perhaps he can be convinced to sell that property for the right price." Ethan's expression was determined. "I've been saving to expand my herd, but this seems a better use of those funds. You would spend your savings on a stranger." Josephine couldn't comprehend his offer. "Why?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "During the war, I saw things that haunt me still. Men treating other men as less than human. I swore then that if I survived, I would never stand by while someone suffered that kind of injustice, not if I could help." He met her gaze steadily. "I have the means to help you, Miss Zimmer, if you'll allow it." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. Even if he agreed, I could never repay such a debt. It wouldn't be a debt, Ethan said firmly. Your freedom would be yours alone to do with as you choose. Whether that means staying here, heading west, or making a new life elsewhere, the decision would be entirely yours. The generosity of his offer stunned her. You would risk confronting Roth. He's dangerous, Mr. Vance. Ethan, he corrected gently. And yes, I would, but not alone. A glint of steel entered his eyes. I have friends from the war days who owe me favors, men who would ensure Roth understands the wisdom of accepting a fair offer. Josephine considered his words. The thought of Ethan confronting Roth terrified her, yet the possibility of true freedom, legal freedom that couldn't be challenged, was too powerful to dismiss. How would you approach him? She asked finally. Carefully, Ethan replied with a hint of a smile. First, I'd need to visit town, send some telegrams. My friends would need a few days to arrive. He studied her face. Can you bear staying hidden here that long? Josephine nodded slowly. Yes, if you truly believe this could work. I do. Ethan rose from the table. I'll ride into Clearwater this afternoon. It's a small town, but they've got a telegraph office. With luck, help will arrive within the week. The days that followed established an unexpected rhythm. Josephine remained inside or close to the house, always alert for riders on the horizon. Ethan provided her with one of his shirts and an old pair of trousers he'd outgrown in width, but still fit her in length when rolled up. The clothes were more practical than her tattered dress, allowing her to move freely as she took over the household tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes that had clearly been neglected. Each evening, they would sit on the porch as twilight descended, talking in low voices about their lives. Ethan spoke of growing up in Pennsylvania, of joining the Union Army at 19, of the battles that had shaped him and the friends who had died. Josephine shared memories of her parents, of the small farm they'd worked until fever had taken them both in the same terrible winter, leaving her at the mercy of a system that had ultimately betrayed her. They were careful not to venture too deeply into the darker territories of their pasts, yet understanding grew between them, a recognition of shared pain and resilience. Josephine found herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, noting the gentle way he handled animals, the quiet competence with which he managed his ranch, the rare but transformative smile that softened his features when something amused him. On the fourth day, riders approached from the east, 3 men on horseback, moving with the alert posture of soldiers despite their civilian clothing. Josephine retreated to her room as Ethan went to greet them. Through her window, she watched their meeting, tension coiled in her stomach until she saw Ethan's relaxed stance and the way he clasped forearms with each man in turn. These were his friends, then the help he'd summoned. When Ethan brought them inside, he introduced them simply as James, Marcus, and Daniel, former cavalry officers who had served under his command. All 3 men greeted Josephine with respectful nods, their eyes taking in her healing ankle wounds with grim understanding. We've devised a plan, Ethan explained as they gathered around his table. Daniel has been making inquiries. Roth will be in Clearwater tomorrow for a meeting with cattle buyers. It provides an opportunity to approach him on neutral ground. Marcus, a broad-shouldered man with a carefully trimmed beard, spread out a rough map of the town. The meeting is at the hotel at noon. We'll position ourselves strategically, James inside the hotel, Daniel and I on the street. Ethan will approach Roth as he's leaving, make the offer. What if he refuses? Josephine asked, her voice smaller than she intended. James, the oldest of the 3 with silver threading through his dark hair, smiled thinly. Men like Roth understand 2 things, money and power. We'll make sure he understands that Ethan has both. The key, Daniel added, is ensuring he sees this as a business transaction, not a personal defeat. His pride will be the biggest obstacle. And if he still refuses, she pressed. The 4 men exchanged glances before Ethan answered. Then we moved to less conventional methods. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. The men spent the remainder of the day finalizing their strategy, while Josephine prepared a meal large enough to feed them all. As they ate, conversation drifted to lighter topics, memories of their time together during the war, updates on families, and mutual acquaintances. Josephine observed the easy camaraderie between them, the shorthand of men who had faced death together. When darkness fell, the visitors set up camp near the barn despite Ethan's offer of floor space in the house. "Old habits," James explained with a shrug. "Besides, best if we're positioned to spot any unwelcome visitors during the night." Alone with Ethan after they departed, Josephine found herself struggling to articulate her emotions. "I don't know how to thank you," she finally said. "What you're risking is my choice," he interrupted gently, "and worth the risk." "But why?" The question had burned within her for days. "You barely know me." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkened prairie visible through the window. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "you recognize something in another person, something that resonates with your own experience." He turned to face her. "When I look at you, I see someone who has endured things that would break most people, yet retained their humanity. That's rare, Josephine, and worth protecting." His use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "And if this works, if Roth agrees, then you'll be free to choose your own path." His expression remained carefully neutral. "As I said before, there would be no obligation to me, none at all." Josephine studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes that belied his casual tone. "And if I chose to stay, at least for a while." Something flickered in Ethan's gaze, hope, quickly suppressed. "Then you'd be welcome for as long as you wished," he said quietly. "This place could use a woman's touch, and he hesitated. "I've grown accustomed to your company." It wasn't a declaration of feeling, yet Josephine sensed the depth of what remained unsaid. This honorable man, who had offered her sanctuary without expectation, would never presume upon her gratitude. The realization touched her deeply. "We should both rest," she said finally. "Tomorrow will be challenging." Ethan nodded, and they parted for the night, each retreating to their separate rooms with thoughts too complex to voice. Morning arrived with a nervous energy permeating the ranch. Ethan's friends were already awake and preparing when Josephine emerged from the house, dressed once more in her original dress, which she had painstakingly cleaned and mended over the past days. It wasn't much, but it was more appropriate for town than Ethan's borrowed clothes. "You don't need to come," Ethan said as she approached the men. "It might be safer if you remained here." Josephine shook her head firmly. "This concerns my freedom. I won't hide while others determine my fate." She met his concerned gaze steadily. "I'll stay out of sight, but I need to be there." After a brief discussion, they agreed that Josephine would accompany them but remain with Daniel at the edge of town, away from the hotel where the confrontation would occur. If things went poorly, he would ensure her escape while the others dealt with the consequences. The ride to Clearwater took just over an hour, the small town appearing suddenly from the rolling landscape, a collection of wooden buildings straddling a dusty main street, with the promised hotel standing as its most impressive structure. As planned, they separated upon arrival. James entered the hotel directly, while Marcus positioned himself at the saloon across the street. Ethan and Daniel, with Josephine riding double with the latter, continued to the livery stable at the far end of town. "This is where we part ways for now," Daniel said, helping Josephine dismount. "Stay inside the stable. The owner is a friend. He'll claim you're a relative if anyone asks." Ethan approached, his expression tense. From a pocket, he withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "This should be enough," he said, though doubt flickered in his eyes. Roth is a businessman at heart, whatever else he may be. Josephine reached out impulsively, grasping his hand. "Be careful," she whispered. "He's unpredictable when challenged." Ethan's fingers tightened briefly around hers. "I'll see you soon," he promised, before turning to walk with determined strides toward the hotel. The wait was excruciating. Josephine paced the confines of the stable, watching the street through gaps in the wooden slats. Daniel remained outside, his posture casual but alert, as he pretended to inspect horses while maintaining clear sightlines to the hotel. Nearly an hour passed before movement at the hotel entrance caught their attention. A group of men emerged, their fine clothes and confident bearing marking them as the cattle buyers. Behind them came Victor Roth. Josephine's breath caught at the sight of him tall and imposing in his tailored suit. Silver-streaked hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness of his eyes. She had spent 3 years under his control, yet seeing him now in the context of freedom made him seem simultaneously more frightening and more pathetic. Ethan approached from across the street, intercepting Roth as the cattle buyers continued toward the saloon. Though too distant to hear their exchange, Josephine could read the body language, Ethan's direct stance, Roth's initial surprise giving way to calculation. When Ethan produced the pouch of coins, Roth's eyebrows rose. The conversation continued for several minutes, tension evident in both men's postures. At one point, Roth laughed dismissively, starting to turn away before Ethan said something that made him pause. Across the street, Marcus had emerged from the saloon, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. James appeared at the hotel entrance, similarly positioned. Roth glanced between them, his expression darkening as he recognized the tactical positioning. Yet rather than anger, a shrewd assessment seemed to overtake his features. He turned back to Ethan, saying something that made the younger man's jaw tighten. Finally, Roth extended his hand. Ethan hesitated before shaking it briefly. Money changed hands, not just the pouch but additional bills that Ethan produced from an inner pocket. In return, Roth withdrew papers from his jacket, handing them over with a mocking bow. Daniel let out a low whistle. "He's done it," he murmured. "Stay here while I make sure it's not a trick." He moved casually down the street, positioning himself to intercept Ethan, who was now walking away from Roth with the papers clutched in his hand. They conferred briefly before both men glanced toward the livery stable. Daniel raised a hand in a subtle signal. "It's safe," the stable owner said from behind Josephine, making her start. The older man smiled kindly. "Your friends have handled the situation. You can go to them now." Heart pounding, Josephine stepped out into the sunlight. Ethan saw her immediately, his face breaking into a rare, unguarded smile that transformed his features. He quickened his pace, meeting her halfway down the street. "It's done," he said simply, holding out the papers. "These are yours now." With trembling fingers, Josephine took the documents, her indenture contract with Roth's signature at the bottom, and beside it, a bill of sale transferring ownership to Ethan Vance. Beneath that was a third document, a manumission certificate, already signed by Ethan, granting her complete and unconditional freedom. "You've already signed it," she whispered, staring at the final paper. "As I promised," Ethan replied softly, "your freedom is yours alone." Tears blurred her vision as the full impact of what had transpired washed over her. "How much did it cost?" she asked, glancing at Roth, who watched them from outside the hotel with barely concealed rage beneath his composed exterior. "Everything I had saved," Ethan admitted. "And it was still less than your worth." "I'll repay you," Josephine began, but Ethan shook his head firmly. "No, this isn't a transaction between us." His gaze held her steadily. "This is simply righting a wrong." Daniel approached, breaking the moment. "We should leave," he said in a low voice. "Roth has accepted the outcome for now, but I don't trust him not to reconsider once his pride reasserts itself." Ethan nodded, guiding Josephine back toward the livery stable where their horses waited. James and Marcus joined them, all 5 mounting quickly and riding out of town at a pace just short of suspicious haste. Only when Clearwater had disappeared behind them did Josephine feel the tension begin to ease from her shoulders. She rode beside Ethan, the precious papers securely tucked inside her dress, against her heart. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly, their horses walking close enough that only she could hear. Josephine considered the question that had occupied her thoughts throughout the long night. Freedom was a vast, intimidating concept after years of captivity. Yet as she glanced at Ethan's profile, the straight nose, the firm jaw, the eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness, she realized that her heart had already decided. "If your offer still stands," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "I would like to stay, at least for a while." Ethan's eyes met hers, surprise giving way to something warmer. "The offer stands," he replied simply, "for as long as you wish." The return to the ranch was marked by a cautious celebration. Ethan's friends remained overnight, their presence a buffer against potential retaliation from Roth. They shared a meal that Josephine prepared with special care, raising glasses of whiskey to toast her freedom. As night fell, the men settled around a small fire outside, exchanging stories and keeping watch. Josephine excused herself, retreating to the porch where she could observe the stars emerging in the vast Texas sky. After a few minutes, she heard footsteps and turned to find Ethan approaching. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Please do," she replied, moving to make room on the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the fire cast dancing shadows across the yard. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally, "about the arrangement moving forward." Josephine felt a pang of uncertainty. "Arrangement, if you're to stay," he clarified. "I want to be sure you understand that you're not replacing one form of servitude with another. This would be a partnership. I can't offer much in the way of wages. Right now the ranch barely breaks even most years and after today." He gestured vaguely, indicating the financial sacrifice he'd made. "I don't need wages," Josephine replied softly, "just a place to belong." Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious. "You've had your choices taken from you for too long. I don't want to be another person who decides your path." The consideration in his words touched her deeply. "What if I choose this path?" she asked. "What if I choose to build something here with you?" A vulnerability she hadn't seen before crossed his features. "Is that what you want?" "I think it could be," she admitted. "In time, when I've had a chance to understand what freedom truly means." She hesitated, then added quietly, "But I know that I feel safe with you, Ethan, and that's something I haven't felt in a very long time." He nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Then we take it one day at a time. No expectations beyond what you're comfortable with." A small smile touched his lips. "Though I should warn you that my friends are already planning to return for a proper celebration once we're certain Roth has accepted the situation. They seem quite taken with you." Josephine laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. "They're good men." "You're fortunate in your friends." "I am," Ethan agreed, his gaze lingering on her face. "And in other things as well, it seems." The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to life at the ranch. Josephine gradually settled into her freedom, learning to make decisions without fear of punishment, to speak her mind without calculation, to move through the world as a person rather than property. Ethan was patient, never pushing, always careful to offer choices rather than directives. They worked side by side during the days, Josephine taking charge of the household, while also learning aspects of ranch management that interested her. She proved to have a natural affinity for the financial side of the operation, organizing Ethan's haphazard accounts and identifying ways to increase profitability. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch, watching the sunset while discussing the day's events or sharing more pieces of their pasts. Josephine learned about Ethan's childhood as the son of a blacksmith, his decision to join the Union Army despite his father's objections, the nightmares that still occasionally haunted him from the battles he'd fought. In turn, she gradually revealed more of her own history, her happy early years on her parents' farm, the shock of being sent to the orphanage after their deaths, the slow, horrible realization of what Roth truly intended when he'd claimed her as his ward. "How did you maintain hope?" Ethan asked one evening as they sat beneath a sky blazing with stars. 3 years in those conditions, lesser souls would have broken. Josephine was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I'm not sure it was hope exactly," she said finally. "More a refusal to let him take the last part of me that was still mine, my belief that I deserved better than what he'd made of me." She glanced at Ethan. "We all have that inner place that belongs only to us, I think, even in the worst circumstances." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "During the war, I saw men in prison camps who held onto something similar. The ones who survived were often those who maintained that private self, even when everything else was stripped away." They fell silent, the chirping of crickets and distant howl of coyotes the only sounds disturbing the peace of the evening. Josephine was acutely aware of Ethan beside her, the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling night air, the subtle scent of leather and horses that clung to him, the way his presence had become a comfort rather than a threat. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Ethan turned to look at her, eyebrows raised in question. "Not just for buying my freedom," Josephine clarified, "but for giving it to me completely, for understanding what that means." His expression softened. "Freedom isn't something that should be given or taken, it's a natural right." "Yet so many deny it to others," she observed. "To their shame," Ethan replied simply. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Josephine found herself studying his face, the straight line of his nose, the slight cleft in his chin, the eyes that held such kindness when they looked at her. Without conscious thought, she leaned slightly toward him. Ethan remained very still, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her eyes again. The question in them was clear, was she certain? In answer, Josephine closed the distance between them, pressing her lips gently to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened, as Ethan responded with carefully restrained passion. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing softly against her skin. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted quietly. "Why didn't you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because it needed to be your choice, freely made." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "I never wanted you to feel obligated." Josephine smiled, her heart full with the understanding of how rare this man truly was. "The only obligation I feel," she whispered, "is to my own heart, and it's been drawing me toward you from the beginning." Their second kiss held more confidence, a mutual exploration rather than a question. When they separated, Ethan's expression was both joyful and cautious. "We should take this slowly," he said, though his eyes betrayed his reluctance. "You're still healing in many ways." Josephine nodded, appreciating his restraint even as part of her longed to surrender completely to the feelings building between them. "Slowly," she agreed, "but not too slowly." Life took on a sweeter quality as autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and changing colors to the landscape. Josephine's relationship with Ethan evolved gradually, each day bringing new discoveries about one another and deeper connection. Word came from Ethan's friends that Roth had indeed accepted the outcome of their transaction, focusing his attention on a new railroad investment rather than pursuing vengeance. The news allowed Josephine to relax fully for the first time, to venture into Clearwater with Ethan without constantly looking over her shoulder. The small town became familiar territory as she accompanied him on weekly trips for supplies. Initially, townsfolk regarded her with curiosity. Ethan Vance had been a solitary figure for years, and the sudden appearance of a young woman at his side generated inevitable speculation. But Josephine's gentle manners and obvious affection for Ethan soon won them over. "Mrs. Peterson at the general store asked when we're getting married," Josephine mentioned casually one afternoon as they rode home, supplies packed in saddlebags and a small wagon trailing behind Ethan's horse. Ethan nearly dropped his reins, shooting her a startled glance. "She did." Josephine laughed at his expression. "Don't worry, I explained that we're taking our time to know each other properly." "And what did she say to that?" Ethan asked, recovering his composure. "That at our age, we don't have time to waste." Josephine's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Apparently, we should be working on producing children immediately." Ethan's face flushed and he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Peterson has always been rather direct in her opinions." "Indeed." Josephine studied him thoughtfully. "It did make me wonder, though. Have you never thought of marriage before? You're 32, most men are settled with families by your age." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I considered it once. There was a young woman in Pennsylvania before the war. We had an understanding." His expression grew distant. "But the man who returned from fighting wasn't the same one who left. She deserved better than what I'd become." "What had you become?" Josephine asked softly. "Haunted," he replied simply. "Unable to sleep through the night without waking in a cold sweat. Quick to anger, slow to laugh." He glanced at her. "It took years to find my way back to some version of myself I could recognize." Josephine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We all carry those changes, the before and after of our worst experiences." Yes. Ethan's gaze softened as he looked at her. But sometimes, the after can be stronger than the before if we're fortunate enough to heal. And have you healed, she asked. A small smile touched his lips. More than I ever expected to, especially these past months. The implication warmed her heart. Mrs. Peterson would be pleased to hear that. Ethan laughed, the sound carrying across the open prairie. Let's not encourage her just yet. I'd prefer to court you properly before the entire town starts planning our wedding. Court me. Josephine repeated, delight blooming in her chest. That sounds very formal. Perhaps, Ethan acknowledged, but some traditions have merit. You deserve to be wooed, Josephine Zimmer, not simply acquired. The deliberate choice of words so different from how Roth had viewed her made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. I think I would like that very much, she said softly. Their courtship proceeded with a sweetness that healed wounds in both their hearts. Ethan proved to be attentive in ways that surprised and delighted Josephine, bringing her wildflowers gathered during his rides across the property, carving a small wooden box for her few treasures, reading aloud from books in the evenings by lamplight. For her part, Josephine flourished in her newfound freedom and the growing certainty of Ethan's affections. She expanded the kitchen garden, adding herbs and vegetables that transformed their meals. She took over correspondence with cattle buyers, discovering a talent for negotiation that increased their profits. And gradually, she allowed herself to dream of a future that once seemed impossible, a life built on mutual respect and deepening love. As winter approached, bringing the first cold winds across the prairie, Ethan rode to town one morning without explaining his purpose. He returned with a package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to Josephine with uncharacteristic nervousness. What is this? She asked, accepting the parcel. Open it and see, he replied, watching her intently. Inside, she found a beautiful dress of deep blue wool, practical for the coming season yet finer than anything she'd owned in years. Beneath it lay a pair of sturdy winter boots in her size. Ethan, she breathed, running her fingers over the soft fabric. This is too much. There's one more thing, he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet pouch. This is the real reason for my trip. Josephine's heart quickened as she accepted the pouch, loosening the drawstring to tip its contents into her palm. A simple gold ring with a small pearl set in its center gleamed in the afternoon light. It's not fancy, Ethan said apologetically, but the pearl reminded me of you, something beautiful that emerges from difficulty. Tears blurred Josephine's vision as she looked up at him. Are you asking me to marry you? Ethan took her free hand in his. I am. I love you, Josephine Zimmer. Not for what you can do or be for me, but for who you are, strong, kind, resilient. His eyes held her steadily. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Josephine closed her fingers around the ring, its weight solid and real in her palm. When I came here, she said quietly, I had nothing, not even ownership of myself. Now you're offering me a partnership of equals. She smiled through her tears. How could my answer be anything but yes? The relief and joy that transformed Ethan's face made her heart swell. He gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that still amazed her after all she had endured. When? He asked against her hair. Spring would be traditional, but I find I'm not feeling particularly patient. Josephine laughed softly. Neither am I. Before Christmas. That would give us time to invite your friends and make proper arrangements. Ethan nodded, pulling back slightly to look at her face. Christmas it is. Though I should warn you that once I tell James, Marcus, and Daniel, they'll descend on us with more celebration than this ranch has ever seen. Good, Josephine said firmly. It's time this place heard more laughter. Their wedding was indeed a joyful affair, though small by most standards. Ethan's friends arrived a week beforehand, helping with final preparations and filling the ranch house with boisterous energy. The ceremony itself was held in the small church in Clearwater, with the town's residents turning out in force to witness the union of the once solitary rancher and the young woman who had so clearly transformed his life. Josephine wore her blue wool dress with a crown of winter greenery in her dark hair. Ethan, unaccustomed to formal attire, had nonetheless purchased a new suit for the occasion, looking handsome if slightly uncomfortable in the stiff collar. The pastor spoke of commitment and partnership, of building something that would withstand the hardships of frontier life. When it came time to exchange vows, Ethan's voice was steady and sure as he promised to cherish and respect Josephine for all their days together. When her turn came, Josephine added words of her own to the traditional promises. "I choose you freely, with clear eyes and an open heart. My love is a gift that belongs to me alone, and I give it to you without reservation or condition." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Ethan slipped the pearl ring onto her finger, sealing their union with a kiss that balanced passion with the dignity of the occasion. The celebration afterward, held at the ranch, continued well into the night. Neighbors and townspeople mingled with Ethan's military friends, sharing food, music, and stories. As darkness fell, lanterns illuminated the yard, and someone produced a fiddle, encouraging couples to dance beneath the winter stars. Ethan led Josephine in a somewhat clumsy waltz, his usual grace hampered by nervousness. "I'm afraid I never learned to dance properly," he admitted as they moved around the makeshift dance floor. "Neither did I," Josephine replied, smiling up at him. "We can learn together." As the evening progressed and guests began to depart, James approached them with raised glasses and a toast. "To Ethan and Josephine Vance, may your union be as strong as your characters, and as enduring as your courage." The remaining guests cheered, and Josephine felt a sense of completion unlike anything she had experienced before. From captivity to freedom, from isolation to community, from fear to love, the journey had been more remarkable than she could have imagined when she fled into the Texas night months before. Later, when they were finally alone in the house that was now truly their shared home, Ethan took her hands in his. "Are you happy?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Josephine reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that spoke of both hardship and laughter. "Happier than I ever believed possible," she answered truthfully. "You gave me my freedom, Ethan, but more importantly, you gave me the space to discover who I am when I'm not afraid." "And who is that?" he asked softly. "A woman who chooses you," she replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "Every day I choose you. That's the greatest gift of freedom, the power to choose love." Ethan's arms encircled her, drawing her close against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "And I choose you," he whispered against her hair. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." In the years that followed, the Vance Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Josephine's head for business complemented Ethan's practical knowledge of cattle and land, creating an operation that grew steadily more successful. They added rooms to the house as their family expanded, first with the birth of their daughter, Emma, followed 2 years later by twin boys, Thomas and Samuel. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving in ways that sometimes surprised even himself. Josephine would often find him sitting on the porch with one or more children on his lap, telling stories of brave horses and kind cowboys as the Texas sun set beyond the prairie. They never hid the truth of their beginnings from their children, believing that understanding both darkness and light was essential to appreciating the value of freedom and compassion. As the children grew old enough to comprehend, Josephine shared age-appropriate versions of her captivity and escape, always emphasizing the courage it takes to believe in a better future, even in the darkest circumstances. Victor Roth faded into a distant memory as the years passed, his power diminished by time and happiness. Occasionally, news would reach them of his business dealings or social appearances in Austin society, but such information held no fear for Josephine anymore. The man who had once owned her body had never truly possessed her spirit, a fact that became her greatest source of pride. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Josephine with a gift, the deed to an adjacent property he had quietly purchased, doubling the size of their ranch and securing their children's future. "You've built something remarkable here," he told her as they stood together on a ridge overlooking their expanded land. "Far more than I ever imagined possible when I was alone." "We built it together," Josephine corrected gently, leaning against his side. At 30, she had blossomed into a woman of quiet confidence, respected throughout the region for both her business acumen and her generous heart. "Ethan," now in his 40s with silver beginning to thread through his hair, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. Staying here instead of seeking adventure elsewhere once you were free, Josephine considered the question seriously, as was her nature. "No," she said finally. "Adventure isn't always about distance traveled. Sometimes it's about depth experienced." She looked up at him, love evident in her gaze. "We've built something rare, Ethan, something true," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "From the moment you arrived in my barn, covered in dust and defiance, I knew my life would never be the same." His voice grew soft with memory. "I just never imagined how much better it would become." Josephine smiled, thinking of the frightened young woman she had been, and the journey that had brought her to this moment, standing beside the man she loved, overseeing the land they shared, with their children's laughter carrying on the prairie wind. "Freedom is only the beginning," she said, echoing words she often shared with other women who had endured hardship. "What matters is what we build with it." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across their land, Ethan and Josephine turned toward home, not the structure of wood and stone that sheltered them, but the enduring bond they had forged together, a sanctuary built on respect, choice, and abiding love. In the distance, their children raced across the open prairie, faces alight with the joy of unfettered movement, a joy Josephine recognized and cherished all the more for having once been denied it. They were growing up knowing only freedom and belonging, their futures as wide open as the Texas sky. "They'll carry our story forward," Ethan observed, following her gaze. "Long after we're gone, they'll remember what it means to choose love over fear, connection over power." "Yes," Josephine agreed, her heart full. "That's a legacy worth building." Hand in hand, they walked toward their waiting family, each step a testimony to the truth they had discovered together. That freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of possibility, and that love, freely given and received, is the greatest possibility of all.